The Atlanta Story is a podcast highlighting Atlanta's most interesting creators, entrepreneurs, and builders. I'm JC Lucas with Atlanta Ventures and co-producer alongside Jon Birdsong. In today's episode, Jon sits down with Greg Bluestein, AJC's premier political reporter and newly minted author of Flipped. Greg spent the first part of his career at the Associated Press before transitioning to the AJC. Greg and his colleagues cover the daily political pulse of Georgia through the Jolt, with more detailed coverage on his twice-a-week podcast, Politically Georgia. In today's episode, Greg shares his insights on the 2020 election, how and why Georgia is transitioning blue, stories from his new book, and much more. We hope you enjoy the show and subscribe to The Atlanta Story.
Greg Bluestein, welcome to the Atlanta Story podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel the energy, the pulse of the Atlanta and Georgia political world is in this small room in the Atlanta Tech Village.
I feel the pulse of coffee. So,
what a time to be a reporter for the state of Georgia. And before we get into some of the trends and highlights, did you always know you wanted to be a reporter?
I've wanted to be a reporter since the fourth grade. I was a student at Greenfield Hebrew Academy, and I.J. Rosenberg, who is the Atlanta Braves beat reporter for the AJC at the time, came in to speak to our class. And it's funny because I see him all the time now. And I always remind him of the story. And I had no idea what he said to the class that day. I have no idea if he imparted wisdom or if he just said hi to everyone. But all I know is I came home from school that day and said to my mom that I wanted to be an AJC reporter one day, covering the Braves. And I was obsessed. That was the worst of first year. And
91.
And she reminded me.
Ron Gant,
David Justice, Tom Glavine.
Oh, the best.
Just the best. And she reminded me that, but to be a reporter, you have to learn how to type. And so I said, maybe I'll do something easier. And eventually I switched over to being a doctor. I got a lot of 2s in high school AP exams, and something was trying to tell me to go back into journalism. And the father of a dear friend of mine in high school reignited my passion for journalism. And in high school, I joined the North Springs High School Oracle and worked for the Red and Black right when I got to UGA.
Yes.
And just from there,
the Red and Black UGA, the Red and Black at UGA, you were editor the last 2 years. Any particular memorable weekly periodical or that came out where you remember most? Yeah,
and it was a daily back then. So It was Monday through Friday. I know now it's not a daily anymore, but it was Monday through Friday. So that was one of the biggest challenges of my life, right? Putting out a daily paper. It had been a daily paper for decades, so it wasn't like we were trying to pioneer this, but just getting out a daily paper with a student-led staff, because we were, students were and still are in charge of the Red and Black. And so corralling, dozens of photographers and reporters and editors to making sure that we get the paper out was such a challenge. But
being editor-in-chief in junior year is probably unique, right?
Yeah, well, senior year. Junior year, I was editor for 1 year. Junior year, I actually took a semester off to go work for the Wall Street Journal as an intern in D.C. So I spent my spring semester that junior year sort of, quote unquote abroad, not really abroad, but in Washington.
Abroad for us Georgia boys.
Exactly. And that was an incredible experience. And then came back and was editor. And in the middle of my stint as editor, there was a huge story about President Adams at the time, Michael Adams, and whether or not a foundation connected to them was misusing Public Monday. And there was this big audit and all this stuff that was major news. And it was breaking right as we had we had fall break, which was Georgia-Florida weekend. And the audit wasn't supposed to come out till I think Thursday or Friday, and we were off school that day, so we weren't publishing. So I instructed my staff. I said, we have to break this story in Wednesday's paper because it was something we had been covering so intently. And so when you ask what was the biggest, one of those memorable stories, it was definitely that. But otherwise, I started a Sex in the Classic City column that one of our that we pioneered at the Red and Black that year that a columnist wrote who happened
right
to be
in the heart of Carrie and
yep, that was when Sex and the City was the biggest thing in the world, it seemed. And we had a lot of fun and a lot of fun controversies. And it's interesting. I always say this, but it's really interesting because the people that we covered, the students who were in the middle of the spotlight then are still, when I was Red and Black, the SGA president was Latham Sadler, who's now running for U.S. Senate, right? The people in my classes in political science and journalism classes are now still in the thick of things in Georgia politics. And I'm sure with your classes too. So it's really interesting because one of my famed professors, Conrad Fink, used to tell me that. He goes, Bluestein, the people you're covering now, you'll continue to cover. And he was right.
That makes a lot of sense. So editor-in-chief, and then did 7 years at Associated Press.
Yeah, I joined the AP after a year at the Daily Report covering legal. And the AP was where I wanted to be.
That's the creme de la creme, or?
Yeah, I mean, Fink had always kind of steered me there. That professor I just mentioned, he was a former AP vice president, and he worked at the AP kind of in its heyday when they had huge bureaus everywhere, and he was overseas. And I think
when was the heyday of the AP? 80s?
Probably 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
The heyday for a lot of news outlets. I'm not picking an AP. That was when a lot of news outlets had.
Oh, we're going to get into the future of media.
Yeah, I'd love to, because I hope you know what it is, because I don't. So I worked there, and look, when I worked there, just like with many outlets, I started and there was a huge bureau. It was 24 hours at the AP in Atlanta. So it's still, of course, a huge operation internationally, but in Atlanta, it was a huge bureau with more than a dozen reporters and probably more than a dozen editors and people who had different beats. And as I was there, it dwindled from that to basically a handful of reporters by the time I left.
And were you churning stuff out daily, or did you have more, stories that took a month or two to?
Oh, no, it was daily. There were still stories I worked on in the background. You have to learn how to be a multitasker in journalism, any job in journalism. Any journalist, any job, you've got to be a multitasker. There's daily stories all the time. There's weekly stories. There's monthly stories. We just won a nice award called the Toner Award for a project that one of my colleagues, really, my byline's on it as well, but it was my colleague David Wickard, spent months on it. I helped them out, and so did the whole team, but he spent months on it. So sometimes there's those projects, but you have to you've got to be able to work at different speeds. I mean, these days, and we'll get into it, but these days, being a journalist, when I graduated, it was just writing for the newspaper and the website. Now it's blogs and radio and podcasts and all that.
Well,
newsletters.
There's a lot of writers who don't do podcasts, and there's a lot of podcasters who don't write. What is your advice for folks that are in journalism school right now, knowing what you know?
My advice is try it out now, right? Get used to talking about what you cover now as a student or as a young journalist, because it's part of the game now. It's part of the job. And it's fun because you can talk about things that will be really hard to write as a newspaper article or might be in the 16th graph of your story, but you can lead with it. You can talk about it. You can listen to the audio. You can have people hear whatever Donald Trump said the other day about Governor Kemp or whatever the big controversy du jour is. And you can delve into it in a conversational way. And really, as you well know, it's just a different way of reaching audiences. As journalists right now, we just have to find different ways. We get it. Not everyone's going to subscribe to the print paper. Not everyone's going to subscribe online. There's different avenues now that we have to reach viewers and listeners. It might be the newsletters. It might be the morning Jolt. It might be the blog. It might still be print newspapers. It might still be going on the homepage of the website.
And so when you think about how you construct content, you've got the Jolt, which if folks are not subscribers of the Jolt, now's a good time to do it. 99 cents, starting out, and then Politically Georgia, which comes out every Tuesday, right? Thursday.
Twice a week, yeah.
Tuesday, Thursday, and so those from a distant observer's perspective, those are like the pillars right there for you, and then you'll do a lot of longer stuff or books and sprinkle all of that in while also going to so many things, right? Whether it's the National Championship.
Yeah.
Go Dogs. I was like, was he going to write about this?
I kind of did. It was fun because the sports desk asked me, so just as backstory, since I was at AP, one of my side gigs, and of course they didn't pay me for it because I gladly did it, was to be on the sidelines of big games, doing something called running photos, which means we have photographers, AP, AJC, just your average, any photographer. They are shooting pictures on digital cards, and it's still not reliable technology to Wi-Fi them, to wirelessly transmit them to editors. It can be balky. You're in a huge stadium.
5G is not here yet.
5G is not quite here yet in some of those places. And so what I do is after, and for the AJC and for AP and for other major outlets, you can't wait till the end of the game to transmit photos. I mean, there's an insatiable demand for photos instantly right after big plays happen. And so what I have been doing for years, I mean, since right after college, has been on the sidelines at big games next to our photographers, standing behind them in many instances, where after a turnover, after an interception, after a quarter ends, taking their photo cards, running them back to an editor in the bowels of the stadium as quickly as possible, letting the editor edit them, do their gig, and then running back those fresh photo cards to the photographers.
That is so clever.
It's awesome to go. So I get to stand on the sidelines. I get to serve a valuable function, right? Literally, like it's something that they need to do.
Oh, yeah.
But I also get to watch games with a perspective that you just can't buy. I miss parts. There's plays I miss. And frankly, there's plays that you miss because you're not 7 feet tall, right? Like you're looking over players.
Well, following you on Twitter for so many years, every big game I'm always like, Bluestein's always got the hookup.
Yeah, and it's not some crazy connection. I'm not misusing a press pass. I am there to run photos back and forth. But through that, I've gotten to do Super Bowls, SEC Championship, Rose Bowl, MLS Cups, a national championship, all sorts of fun events that you couldn't. I would be in the stands for many of them.
So that brings up an interesting point around social media. So many journalists are trying to still crack the code of social media. Like it's a double-edged sword, right? Of you want to get your content out, but you've also got to be in the confines of the historical journalistic mandates or whatnot. How do you view social media, knowing that arguably you're the best on social media in Atlanta, over 100,000 followers?
I do not feel like I'm the best. I still have not felt like I even get social media a lot. It's strange because there is this compulsion for especially young reporters to feel like they have to opine on everything, even if it has nothing to do with the stories they're covering, or even if it does, they need to chime in. The world is waiting to hear from them. And frankly, that's how you get in trouble. And the world's not waiting to hear from us on every issue, right? And you have to walk that line. On sports, I don't cover sports. I can be, I can be upset when the Braves lose Freddie Freeman, as much as I'm excited about Matt Olson. I can be really upset that a Braves landmark figure is gone. On politics.
Oh, his agent.
I blame his agent. Yeah. I don't really know the story there. I'm still.
I don't either.
I'm waiting for the book.
I loved the Chipper Jones. Whoever was crafting that narrative brought Chipper in. Which was really clever.
Yeah, it was really smart and Chipper, of course, is working for the team, so he has his own distinct perspective. But that all aside, we as reporters, especially at the AJC, we can't use Twitter as the stand-in for a story. Right? Like me tweeting something about some major event that's happening doesn't equal like an actual story about that event. Right. We can't confuse our Twitter audience, our social media audience with our broader duty to report on what's happening. Now, it's a useful tool, especially at a Trump rally, is writing about or tweeting about what's happening, the mood and the atmosphere, but I still wrote.
As far as the eye can see.
As far as the eye can see, right? And you're referring to Donald Trump saying that behind the TV risers at a recent rally, there's people as far as the eye can see. And I literally handed my phone to a TV friend who was on the risers because I couldn't get up there. And I said, can you just take a picture behind you? Took the picture and no, it was not people as far as the eye can see. But it fills that valuable function. But it also doesn't replace our work as journalists. Me tweeting that Governor Kemp just signed a bill, it's cool. That lets people immediately know who are following that Governor Kemp signed that bill. But we also have that underlying duty to write about the bill and write about why the bill is important in the view of the governor and why critics don't like it or whatever it might be. And I think people sometimes can forget that.
And we're going to take a quick break here and share that this podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business out of Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com. You're in such a unique spot because you started right as the internet was getting, pre-YouTube, right?
Yes.
YouTube came out in 2005, 2006. You're already...
I graduated in 04.
04. So it's
from UGA.
From UGA. Go Dogs.
Go
we
Dogs.
Can't say it enough. And so you have this very unique experience of past kind of how the ways were done, and then now this social media, Twitter, trigger fingers. What has that done to the scoop, right? Because you love scoops. I think scoops are something. I mean, even back to the red and black,
Sure.
right? We got to get this out Wednesday.
Yeah.
And walk us through what that means for the scoop, which historically that was how journalists. That was how they beat their chest, right?
Oh, yeah.
Saying, I've got the most sources, I've got the inside baseball.
Yeah. And look, I mean, in part, the scoop, of course, is still important, but so much of our job now is explaining why it's important, right? And that's what that's the value that I guess mainstream media outlets. It's weird saying that, but it's the value that experienced journalists can still bring. Is, hey, a far right media outlet might break some story because a Republican candidate might rather go to them or they might find it out first, right. And they'll make it a leak, or however these things happen. But we can always come in and explain why this is significant. And you're right. What the definition of a scoop has completely changed, because when I was an intern all through those years of pre-YouTube and all that, when the internet was the thing, but it was not nearly what it is now, and it was kind of an afterthought, right? It was like, hey, we'll post a story on the internet, we'll just see. And it would get tens of clicks. Tens, right? Not tons, tens. And print was the big thing. If you got a front page of the AJC as an intern, it was like I got 3. I mean, it was the best, coolest feeling in the world. And now, our interns, I'm sure they love getting a front page story, but no, being the focal point of the website on the homepage, I'm sure is their version of a front page. And getting past that narrative in my own mind, like I have to understand that too, that, what was a big deal, the Sunday front page used to be the ultimate thing. And frankly, as important as that is, the newsletter that I write that me and 2 colleagues, Patricia Murphy and Tia Mitchell, that we work on every morning, that will get more clicks and might resonate in the political world, at least, more than that story that unfortunately that we worked on for 2 months.
Right.
And we just have to come to terms with that sometimes. Not saying we shouldn't work 2 months on those other stories, but sometimes, the story you work on for 2 hours gets a lot more traction than the story you work on for 2 months.
Well, I'll never forget 2018. This was after Governor Kemp beat Stacy Abrams, and there was this degree of, I think there were like 5 different lawsuits, and like you went to Stacy Abrams' Twitter account, you went to Kemp's Twitter account, and they both are claiming that they've won the settlement, right?
Yeah.
And then like when you start like peeling back the layers, like Stacy had won 2, Kemp had won 2 or 3, and like that's the narrative that they're telling. And now you're like, all right, well, who do you believe, or like where does this fit into the overall? And it's so muddy, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like before, what was on the front page of the Sunday paper, people read and they're like, well, these people did a lot of work to like distill all of this, and so I think the state of journalism is in a predicament.
It is. It's in flux too. And we talk about this a lot in terms of Donald Trump's election lies, that I've been to rallies where I've talked to very frustrated Republican voters who desperately want to go support Kelly Loeffler or David Perdue in the runoffs, right? Who said, I just don't know if my vote will be counted. And I want to shout at them as loud as I can. Yes, it will be counted, but it doesn't matter what a reporter to the AJC says. I'll still say it, right? We still report.
Because you're part of,
Yeah, but they're listening to their far right media sphere. And trust me, there's a far left media sphere too. It's not just on the right or the left. It just seems like, especially with lies about elections, it's far more pervasive on the right. And have we figured out a way to answer that? No. And I don't know that we will. And that's the fragmented media sphere, right?
With all of the evidence about the election not being stolen or lack of evidence, why do you think people still believe that it was stolen?
Because there is a website for everything. Because, we can tweet out a PolitiFact or our own stories that show and document in great detail that the election was tallied 3 different times, that an audit of absentee ballots in Cobb County found no illegal votes, that bipartisan election officials, including Trump's own attorney general, have batted down these lies about election fraud, right? That every court case has been dismissed or isn't going forward in some form or fashion. We can say that all we want, but they can find there's a random website with something about chain of custody.
And they are random.
Yeah.
They are so random.
They're like these weird domain names, but with headlines saying the story the mainstream media doesn't want you to know.
I remember talking with Lieutenant Governor Duncan, and he was getting thousands of emails, and he would reply back to every email and saying, if you have evidence, please let me know. And it would be an email that brought him to someone's Facebook status update with a link. Yeah. I was like, that's not evidence.
And that's how this is a shameless plug, but I recount this in my book, Flipped. But that's how it started with Jeff Duncan. Was he started after November. Remember, he is a very staunch Donald Trump ally before all this. Was one of the first people to greet him on stage
in Rome.
And when Donald Trump came out of Air Force One, was there to greet him and got his support and endorsement.
Totally,
it's very important to him. But then after Trump's election defeat, Jeff Duncan would go on TV, and at first he would say that he would go on CNN and say, "Look, if there is evidence, come bring it to me. We want to investigate it too. Let us know. I will make sure that the highest levels of state government know about it, and no one can bring him any credible evidence." And then you saw his evolution from asking for the evidence to going to a situation where he's now saying there is no evidence. We need to move on as a Republican Party from all this. And that's a whole separate story. But it was interesting watching that evolution of Jeff Duncan.
Yeah, I think history will judge him well with that. So let's talk about your prolific nature that evolves into the book. So you just wrote a book with 352 pages.
Good memory.
Thank you. And you're still doing 2 podcasts a week. You're doing the Jolt every day. Why now? And how did you get it done? And the book, Flipped, how Georgia turned purple and broke the monopoly on Republican power.
Why now? Well, Georgia is the most important battleground state in the nation. And I think it will be the rest of the decade. We'll find out. But I think it will be the rest of the decade. And because those names that we were just talking about, Jeff Duncan, Brian Kemp, Brad Raffensperger, David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler, Stacy Abrams, of course.
Yeah, I saw you put Trump twice on the cover of your book.
I didn't do that, but they did, yeah. But no, they've become household names. And these Georgia politicians have become household names throughout the nation. And they aren't going away, right? Stacy Abrams has said it herself. She wants to run for president. You better believe John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock have ambitions to play a greater role in national politics. They have never told me that, but you can tell. And of course, Brian Kemp, David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler, they're not going anywhere. They're still right in the thick of politics. So that's the why now. And I felt like we needed to tell the story from, to take a step back. Something Jim Galloway, one of my mentors and former colleagues, the retired political insider for the AJC, something he always said about our work and about the blog was, we want to be somewhere where Republicans can find out what Democrats are doing, what Democrats can find out what Republicans are doing. Part of our job, and part of that challenge, especially with younger reporters on Twitter and social media, because they can burn sources. Trust me, there are politicians watching, even if they don't even follow you or there are people watching what you tweet and they're looking for any signs of bias. And part of our job is to be the objective. Look, we'll call out Donald Trump's lies about election fraud, right? But we also have to be objective. That's objective to call out his lies. But we also have to be objective in general when it comes to partisan politics. And to be somewhere where Republicans and Democrats can both trust you and talk to you about what's going on. And that's what I try to do with this book on a broader scale, was write, the book isn't just about the title is How Democrats Flip the State, right? But it's not just about what the Democrats did. I've got the voices of Republicans and Republican candidates, operatives, voters, activists, all throughout the book about what their viewpoint was through all of this, what their mentality. I go into the backstories of Brian Kemp, David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler, Doug Collins, all the main players. And that's such an important role for journalists today, is because you were talking about the fragmented media sphere. Well, reporters at the AJC, we talk to Democrats and Republicans. We try to give people the full picture of what's happening.
So at a macro level, flipped, talk about some of the trends that you excavate.
Yeah, that's a good word. One of them is authenticity. You've seen the Democratic transformation from Democrats running as, in the views of critics, of Republican lights, running as NRA Democrats, which, by the way, was the conventional wisdom. It was not shocking that Democrats ran like that in past election cycles, to going kind of full circle and now running as authentic liberals on many issues, not on all, but on many issues, and how that helped engage and energize voters who were on the sidelines, voters who felt disengaged, especially younger voters and especially voters of color who would skip midterms and even skip some presidential elections because they felt like neither candidate was speaking to them. You saw Georgia Democrats, including Stacy Abrams, try to reimagine their message starting in 2018 with that campaign. And so that's a major part of the book. Of course, the Trump factor, right, that continues to be an issue in 2022, even though he's not on the ballot, that helped shape the race too. So, Republicans were hindered by that, of course, but also Democrats had to play their part in order to flip. There wasn't, it's a lot of Republicans like to look back, especially privately, and say, oh, we just lost those races because of Trump. Trump played a role, but Democrats had to do their part too and engage voters with their messaging, and they did.
Yeah, I mean, Stacy Abrams in the Fair Fight, I mean, she's done a lot of work to make sure people are registered and voted. How much of a difference do you think that made in 2020 and will make in 2022?
I mean, she was the party queen maker in 2020, right? Even though she wasn't on the ballot, and I go into detail about why she wasn't on the ballot. She was looked at as a potential U.S. Senate candidate. Chuck Schumer went to great lengths to try to recruit her to run for the seat that Raphael Warnock ended up running for. Jon Ossoff even said, I want her to run. If she wants to run against David Perdue, he was ready for her to run in that other seat. And so she played this behind the scenes role, and really, in front of the scenes as well, especially near the end of the campaign, of helping to lead the charge. But of course, it was the candidates themselves that put themselves over the finish line. But Stacey Abrams' role really goes back a decade. And it goes back to her vision of remaking the Democratic Party of Georgia into a more effective fighting force, and to moving away from that conventional approach that I was talking about that was seen as, the only way to win. I mean, this is not a knock on Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn in 2014, because when they ran as Jason Carter voted for a gun expansion. When Barack Obama came to town, neither of them were anywhere to be seen. They were both in rural Georgia at other meetings because they didn't want to be seen with Barack Obama. And now it seems shocking. How could you, if Obama comes, Stacey Abrams campaigned with Barack Obama, so did Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, not that long ago. So
and there's probably just different reasons why Abrams didn't show up with Biden when
that's
Biden
a whole
came.
different story. Yeah. Because look, if you want to talk about that quick, it is, Republicans like to say, oh, she's trying to distance herself from Joe Biden. She can't. There's no way. Yeah. She tried to be his running mate. So even if she doesn't show up at one of his rallies, and there was private personal reasons why she didn't, but even if she didn't, and even if she tried, it's impossible, because there's so many headlines, in her own words, of trying to be literally his running mate. So you can't distance yourself from Joe Biden if you're any Democrat.
So Washington Monthly said about Flipped, Bluestein does not bludgeon you with superficial hot takes. He's a Georgia politics beat reporter and a darn good one. Flip doesn't tell you what to think. It tells you plenty that you don't already know. And I think we just had some good examples of that. Any other examples that you want to just give some of the listeners a taste?
Yeah. And by the way, I don't know what's going to happen, right? And whenever you see all these pundits and others saying that, oh, this is, May's going to be this repudiation of Trump or whatever it might be, I have no idea. That's the beauty of this job. Things change at lightning pace. I don't think anyone thought that Brian Kemp would win in a runaway rout against Casey Cagle, but he got that endorsement 6 days before the runoff in 2018 and won. I loved going back in this book and interviewing hundreds of people and getting the behind the scenes stories and getting the detail and on the personal level. What I try to do throughout the book is paint these candidates as people. They're demonized on all sides, right? Democrats are demonized as radical liberals, Republicans as, whatever, as fascist, whatever you want to call. What they really, they're people. And they had motivations and they had pressures, and it's not apologizing for any of them, but it goes into great detail about why they made the decisions they did throughout the campaign. And I really liked, for instance, we were talking about Kelly Loeffler. I go into great detail about how Brian Kemp picked Kelly Loeffler, what that meeting with Donald Trump was like when Donald Trump realized that Kelly Loeffler is his pick and he wasn't that happy with it.
Right.
And then the next stories of how things came about. And, there's a fun story in Flipped about, we were talking about the personal level, about Attorney General Chris Carr and about how he, around Christmas time, was getting pressured by Donald Trump. And he was just trying to watch the movie Elf with his family, right? His teenage daughter was in the room and he's just trying to watch a movie and Donald Trump is on the phone yelling at him and he knows he can't say anything wrong because he'll get in trouble. But at the same time, he's trying to be a family man. And that's the truth of all these candidates. It is so hard for them, politicians, they signed up for it, but to balance those lives.
So back to the workflow. So you're able to take these interviews that assumingly you're already doing for the Jolt but then tell a kind of broader story with Flipped. Is that how you're able to write a 352-page book and do 2 podcasts a week and write for the Jolt every day?
So I wish I could say I had all this foresight and that I was preparing for the book the entire election cycle, because I wasn't. I didn't get a call till Thanksgiving of 2020, so late November, from an agent saying, I think you've got a book here and I'm going to help you out. And getting an agent in the world of book publishing is like half the battle.
Right.
I mean, there's people I know who have spent years trying to get an agent.
I thought you just called Penguin up and said, hi, I'm Greg Bluestein.
Yeah, right. So the agent basically, I said, look, it's going to be crazy. Trump is about to come in December and I've got to moderate this debate that's going to be the only debate of the Senate runoff. So I'm going to be tied up. But the agent helped me walk through the whole process and was fantastic. And helped me write a book proposal. And in my mind, I was like, I'm going to get this book proposal done by January 1st. I want it in front of the publishers before the January 5th runoff. And so it ended on this cliffhanger because I didn't know. We really didn't know. I felt like the Senate runoff.
So write the whole book in 2 months.
Well, I wrote a book proposal in a month.
Okay.
So it ended up being a 90-page book proposal that ended with a section on the Senate runoffs where we're like, we just don't.
We haven't gotten to halftime yet.
Yeah, exactly. And then after about 2 weeks later, after all these interviews and all that, it was sold. And at that point, you got to go write the book. And that's when I kind of freaked out because I don't know anything about this industry. And I know that, I'm a deadline guy. I'm used to deadlines. I kind of thought there'd be this swarm of editors who'd be helping me out and talking about, here's how you do chapter 1 and here's how you should transition to chapter 6. And it's not like that. Unless you're some famous, for 99% of the authors, it's like, good job. We have faith in you. Go write what you wrote in the book proposal. Go do it. Right. And that it took me a little while to recognize that. But once I recognized that, I was like, okay, good. They have faith in me. They bought the proposal because they do have faith in me, and I'm just going to go write the proposal.
How has the relationship with the Gold Dome and media changed in the Trump era?
That's a good question, because in some sense it hasn't, right? In Washington, I think it has, but on the ground reporters at the Capitol work directly, as close as we're sitting together today with Republican and Democratic lawmakers. Like, we see them every day at the state Capitol in the session, interview them. It is really hard to avoid the Capitol press corps at the Georgia State House, because it's, even for backbench lawmakers who want nothing to do, you'll see us everywhere, right? There's AJC has 8 or 9 reporters on any given day covering different issues at the Capitol. So it's hard to miss us. So, and look, a lot of them might rail against fake news media on Twitter posts and Facebook messaging, but when it comes down to it, they talk to us because they know they need to too, because they know that that we'll write the stories that help define their candidacies and their issues, whether they want us to or not.
Years down the road, what will be the one political reporting moment that you tell your grandkids from 2020, or let's just say the last 18 months?
This sounds really cheesy, because it is, but I brought my kids on the campaign trail with me a lot. My 11-year-old and 8-year-old, so they were like 9 and 6. During the pandemic, we had virtual school, and half the time their school was out like at 1, and they were, playing with friends and bored in the house and watching YouTube or making arts and crafts. So if there was a fun event, if there was an event, no, I shouldn't say fun, if there was an event and they were around, I would drag them to it. And so I think when I look back at 2020, as brutal as that year was, as hard as that was for many reasons, right? Covering a pandemic, epic election cycle, protests for social justice, all those different things that converged. The 3 stories of our lifetime, right, converged for all of us in 1 year. We're all, survivors of like basically post-traumatic stress in some sense, right? But I'll look back and remember bringing my 2 daughters on, and they interviewed David Perdue, John Ossoff, Kelly Loeffler, Raphael Warnock. They went to these small little towns and, got to see little candidate parades and got to go to press conferences and rallies and things like that. They got to see it through a different lens. And so I'll always remember that. I hope they will too.
A few more questions before we wrap up. What is your take on Twitter, YouTube, and the degree of their censorship for the media, in terms of they are now the political square, right? Do you have a take on that? That's
a good point, and I hope they're not, though. Like, I hope we always try to remind ourselves that Twitter is not real life, in a sense, right? Like, as important as it is, like, every journalist has to be on Twitter. The journalists who are not active on Twitter, you're automatically kind of kneecapping yourself. You're limiting your potential audience. Even if a lot of journalists don't like to be on Twitter, you've got to be on it. But it's also not real life, right? There are countless voters who have no idea about the daily, or if they check Twitter or social media on that sense, it's once a day. They don't live on it. They don't breathe on it.
Right.
We as journalists, you in the tech industry, we have to be a little more active. Sometimes I will just completely, I'll be honest, I have to rely on my sources to text me tweets, because I can't be on it all day.
Yeah.
Right. I just can't do it. I time release a lot of tweets, but I can't sit there and look at Twitter
I feel you.
all day. And because we have lives to enjoy too. We want to be with our families and friends and do things, and not obsessively look at Twitter. So
yeah, where I am on Instagram is I took a year off a couple years ago, and now I just look at it on desktop.
Yeah.
Because I just don't want to do the default scroll.
Yeah. That's a good way to do it. I found with the book, I've got to be much more attentive too, because people are DMing me. It's really cool. I'm not complaining. It's awesome. But I've had to go back to paying a lot more attention to even LinkedIn. I'm like not remotely on LinkedIn, and I'm getting messages from readers and stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'm like,
don't sleep on LinkedIn.
No, I know.
You can go deep there.
I got to pay attention to LinkedIn now. But in general, like, we just have to know that just like I was saying earlier, me tweeting about a story, about a bill signing isn't the same thing as me covering it, right?
Right.
There's a whole different audience, and there's a more permanence with me writing an actual story about something, even if it doesn't run in the print newspaper. Me writing a story that's for the archives than me tweeting, Governor Kemp signed this bill today, and here's a picture of it.
So besides continuing the book tour, which we can get on Amazon,
anywhere, any online retailer that sells books, even from Target to Walmart.
I read that there's going to be 25 new Barnes & Nobles opening this year. So,
good. I did not read that, but that's good for the book industry, I think.
And then what's ahead for you? I read about the CNBC, and especially, the next 8 months, 12 months are just going to be lightning.
Yes. So I'm an NBC News analyst now, which has been fun, which is a different way to tell our stories to a broader audience. And of course, there's a national obsession with what's going on in Georgia.
Yes.
As I said, we are the premier battleground state. We're the home to the most interesting and dynamic political races. And we're the most closely divided state in the nation. When you have a presidential election that's divided by just 11,000 votes, that shows you just how, of a state with 11 million plus people, that shows you just how close everything is in Georgia.
I'm still shocked how few people still don't vote. Or how many people don't vote. What was it? 3 million people voted? Something like that?
Five plus, but millions of people don't vote. You're right.
It's still mind-blowing.
And you'll see this cycle, and you see it every cycle, big stories about why so-and-so is not voting. And a long story, and people pay a lot of, people give these in-depth interviews about why they're not voting. And it's not for lack of options, because even if you don't like whoever the major party candidates are, or the libertarian, you can always write in, or you can just skip that race and vote down ticket. Because there's a reason to vote, right? There's always a reason to vote. It might be a down ticket race, the state legislature you want to support, or just a ballot question. You want to vote for a local option sales tax so you can fund roads or schools or whatever is happening in your community. So I don't get it either, but there's millions of people who don't, and even more in a midterm, Yeah. And look, people get disgusted. There's a torrent of ads. It's overwhelming. People have a hard time deciding because they hear the worst about every candidate, and that's part of the tactic too, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's Democrats and Republicans will be using that tactic to affect the vote of their opponents too, of just not just with negative ads, but with they call them voter depressors, like just to depress you about the system and try to keep you home.
Did writing a book make you want to write another one?
It did. Yeah.
Good.
I really did. And this time I'll actually have a plan going in and know that I can do it. Right. I mean, part of that is, for a deadline guy like me, spending a week or two on a story is a very long time because I'm used to immediacy. And now I've had this experience of working for a year on something, about a little less than a year, because the book I had to have kind of finished my book by October-ish. So 9 months on something. When I was ready, if they wanted it, I could have had it done by April. I could have worked 3 months on it and moved it. But no, it was so much fun. I loved it.
Well, we always finish the Atlanta Story podcast with the question of why Atlanta and what has Atlanta done for you?
Why Atlanta? It's everything to me. I don't want to ever leave. I should say I technically live in Dunwoody, but we consider ourselves Atlanta. But no, Atlanta's everything. Atlanta is where my home is, my community is, my family is, my heart is. It's the lifeblood. It's the community around Atlanta, and it's being able to affect some change in Atlanta too, and to have Atlanta's a city where it's not too big, where people who are devoted and dedicated to the future of our city can have a huge change. And you couldn't do that in New York or Chicago in the same sense. And that's the beauty of Atlanta. And that's why, as far as I know, we are never going to leave the city.
Well, to all the readers or our listeners, check out Flipped, subscribe to the Jolt, listen to Politically Georgia Tuesday, Thursday, and it's going to be a wild ride over the next 8 months. Greg, thank you so much for being part of the Atlanta Story.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. It was co-produced by JC Lucas and Jon Birdsong. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business in Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com and the companies we work with who've done it before. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it at your next coffee meeting or dinner greeting, rate it, and write a benevolent, eloquent review.